out of the cradle, endlessly rocking. Today we're talking about Intolerance, 1916, D.W. Griffith, a notorious picture. I would call it pretty damn masterful. D.W. Griffith is an intensely, extremely controversial filmmaker. I was about to say a complicated figure in film history, but he's really not. He was a manically racist man and a full-blown megalomaniac, and certain films of his, watershed films, like The Birth of a Nation, brought the KKK back, revitalized a very specific, gross, chaotic, and tortured kind of hatred and spite and toxicity. That's what D.W. did. A lot of people give D.W. Griffith or like to credit him with a lot of inventions. D.W. Griffith liked to do this too, but he stole most of it from Méliès. Any sort of experimental flourish that he did, he certainly stole from Méliès's early experimental kind of like magic show shorts. He did kind of innovate and invent in a very large way the crosscut and the montage. And Intolerance is a film basically overflowing with that sort of a compositional method that Griffith really arguably did invent, the crosscut. Intolerance is an outstandingly ambitious film. We got 4 different storylines from 4 different periods of time, all aiming to express a kind of mourning for man's intolerance against man, against all facets of what makes up the philosophical nature of man. So, like, of age, of religion, of love, of class, of politics, of God, of everything that could possibly go into it. And I think that Orson Welles really said it best, that it is incredibly ambitious, that he was able to weave together these disparate storylines to tell a cohesive and coherent picture. Orson Welles also said, but maybe he didn't. And that's where I side. I think it's a pretty masterful film, but ultimately I think it's a complete failure. A complete failure of vision, and a complete failure of composition as well, that crosscut that we're talking about. It's used efficiently, it's used inspiringly, but it just doesn't work. Orson Welles put it best when he said that Intolerance is a failure that remains one of the great successes of cinema. There's only one story that I think works, and it's not the original one. Originally, Intolerance was just supposed to be its modern-day story, which is just awful, in my opinion. The bizarre, conservative, hyper-conservative, like, propaganda that Griffith, I would charge him with pushing, is still there, with the villains being social workers and things like that, villains being the long arm of the government. It's not a good story, and that was what Intolerance originally was, until he showed it to people and they said, you can't follow up Birth of a Nation with this, you need something more incredible. The best storyline in this is the Babylon sequence, and I don't care, he did it a lot better than Kabiria. I know a lot of people like to give Kabiria credit, and it should have credit, but Griffith's set, that's probably my favorite movie set of all time. The Babylon set with those giant elephants, it's just so opulent, it's just so lavish, it's so absurdly excessive. It kind of epitomized everything that the age of the teens, or even the silent era in general. It epitomized every kind of vulgar component of that era, of that age, in one set. And I think that he's most inspired and at least most excited there, because ultimately it's a failure of vision. He wanted to make Intolerance in a way to at least do some PR to show he was not racist, because contrary to popular belief, when Birth of a Nation came out, not everyone liked it. A lot of people didn't like it. It was seen as old-fashioned even then, old hat even then. Um, in the NAACP, although it hadn't been around for too long, 1915, successfully organized many protests and shut down screenings of Birth of a Nation. It was not immediately applauded. Uh, the general consensus was that it was extremely old-fashioned, it was racist, it was a backward narrative, and it was dangerous, kind of inflammable artistic material to put out there. It was incredibly toxic. So Griffith wanted to show that he wasn't racist. So he made Intolerance and kind of showed to the world that he was deeply anti-Semitic instead, because one of the stories also follows Jesus. And my God, the Pharisees and the Jews are... It's incredibly offensive. It's incredibly offensive. I mean, if I judge a film based on whether or not the purpose as stated by the director, or not even as stated by the director, just the purposes of the film are successful or not. That's normally how I rate a film. Was it successfully told? And then from there you can go on to how was it told, and get into how great it was compositionally and you know, poetically when speaking of film grammar. Intolerance fails at the first step, because Intolerance does not actually convey what the director intended it to convey. Not even then. Even then it was considered, like I said, old-fashioned. Even then it was considered off the mark. It was considered a failure in a lot of different ways, because Griffith does not translate, does not express or articulate at all with any sort of eloquence, with any sort of coherence. The message of Intolerance does not convey that at all. That is not there. He fails. He fails. He ends up giving us a very intolerant picture without any semblance of the struggle of love through the ages. That is just not there at all, because Griffith's ideal of love is a xenophobic, is a racist, is an incredibly and strictly white point of view, white male point of view, I should actually say. It's it's incredibly problematic isn't the word, it's just a failure, because he fails in the vision right then and there. Now, is it interestingly told? Like I said, the crosscuts, oh my God, foam at the mouth, some of them are just really compelling. And although he did not invent the close-up, although he would gladly take credit for it, a Griffith close-up is full of a lot of poetry, full of a lot of intensity, especially when he's close up on these kind of wholesome, very pure, virginal feeling women that he was so obsessed with. In their close-ups, there's so much intensity, there's a lot of poetic messaging going on there. Intolerance might have my favorite close-ups of Griffith, and the cross-cuts are interesting. It's just that they fail to convey the interconnectedness of these stories. These stories fail to connect, not only in the film's overall messaging, overall goal of messaging, which was the struggle of love throughout all ages of intolerance to try to stifle and murder love. It fails to convey that message, but it also fails to kind of thread together these stories. These stories are not threaded together. And it was overly ambitious, and it simply doesn't work. But where it doesn't work, it is rather fascinating how. Because we're talking D.W. Griffith, master. Yeah, he's a master of film. He's also a master fucking jackass. But a master of film nonetheless. You know, and I keep going back to that Babylon set in my mind because he captured something. He captured movie magic there. And I mean, Intolerance is worth watching just to see that set in action. I also do love each time it changes stories, or at least for a long time, in the interim, when it's changing time periods and characters and stories and narratives. We see like Lillian Gish, who was one of Griffith's muses, and she's kind of in a place that's out of time itself, because all of these places are defined so heavily by period and by setting, by atmosphere, by very specific timelines. Whereas Lillian Gish, when we go back to her rocking that endless cradle, the endless rocking of the cradle, she's in a place that exists outside of time and space. And that's where we really get into some interesting and very, very, very complicated areas, which are worth discussing, because that's where the film can get metaphysical, and not only meta-contextual, but more importantly metaphysical. And Griffith, I think, was always on the precipice of actually making a great, grandiose statement. I know he always wanted to, but Intolerance is a complete failure. Sadly, The Birth of a Nation, on the other hand, is a complete success. He successfully told a very racist narrative. He successfully made millions of people believe that the KKK were heroic. He successfully made history with fire and lightning on celluloid. The Birth of a Nation successfully elevated racism into high art. That's why that film's so dangerous. Intolerance, his apologetic, the follow-up, is a failure. Less dangerous, less toxic than The Birth of a Nation. And I would actually say more technically interesting. At least it's interesting to see how ambition can destroy even the master director archetype that all future master directors are compared against. Intolerance defeated Griffith. When I see this film, I see his own ego writ large, and I see Griffith fumble. He fumbles the ball. I mean, it is fascinating to see how he does so, though. Some of those crosscuts, and like the close-ups, the intensity of them, the pathos within them, the integrity of some of his characters, especially the women in this film, is very interesting. But ultimately, at the end of the day, Intolerance is a massive failure, but it's one of the most interesting and fascinating failures ever wrought upon the human race, ever wrought upon art. It's a fascinating failure. And failure or not, like Orson Welles said, it will always be one of the great successes of film. It's a stepping stone in film grammar, for sure. And it's funny that one of these stepping stones is what happens when your vision and your compositional abilities aren't at the same level. Griffith was a compositional master, a technical wizard of sorts. But his ability to really articulate his vision, his purpose behind the art, outside of The Birth of a Nation, which his purposes were terrible, but he still succeeded in sharing them. He never really had his vision meet his technical capabilities. But those technical capabilities, the compositional mastery, is enough to call him one of those film gods. And I know that makes Griffith really happy somewhere. He's jerking off his racist ass dick to the sound of everyone accepting the Griffith Award. But still, you can't deny mastery. And Griffith was a master. He wasn't a chief inventor or innovator like he used to lay claim to. He was simply a master filmmaker who made some masterfully erroneous failures, both emotionally and specifically historically. Intolerance.